crows circle above a silent battlefield. A woman's shadow moves through the smoke, 3 voices speaking as one. Some called her a goddess, others a curse. But who was she? And why did every warrior in ancient Ireland fear her name? This is the untold story of the Morrigan's curse. Morrigan stands as one of the most fearsome and complex figures in Irish mythology. Her name itself carries weight. Morrigan translates to Great Queen or Phantom Queen, depending on how you interpret the ancient Irish words. Both translations capture something essential. She is great, powerful, commanding respect and fear. She is phantom-like, appearing and disappearing, never fully graspable, always mysterious. But the Morrigan isn't just one goddess. She's actually 3, a trinity of divine power wrapped into a single terrifying presence. This triple nature makes her more complex and more dangerous than a simple war deity. Let's break down her identity into 3 clear parts: her triple nature, her role in Irish mythology's greatest stories, and what her names reveal about ancient Irish understanding. First, the triple goddess aspect. The Morrigan manifests as 3 distinct goddesses, Bab, Macha, and Nemain. Each brings her own particular power and terror. Badby represents battle frenzy, prophecy, and death itself. When warriors entered that altered state of consciousness in combat, that blood-drunk rage that made them capable of extraordinary violence, that was Bab's influence. She also possessed the gift of prophecy, seeing futures written in blood and bone. Her presence on the battlefield meant death was near, inevitable, already decided by forces beyond human control. The name Bab connects to the Irish word for crow or raven, those scavenger birds that haunt battlefields. When ancient Irish warriors saw crows gathering before battle, they knew Bab was present, already selecting who would fall. Macha brings a different dimension. She governs sovereignty, kingship, and the authority to rule. War in ancient Ireland wasn't just about combat. It was about who had the right to control land, to command loyalty, to wear the crown. Macha embodied that political dimension of conflict. She represented the divine approval that kings needed to rule legitimately. Macha also carried associations with horses and warfare's more organized aspects. She wasn't just about individual combat fury. She was about armies, campaigns, the larger movements of power and territory that wars decide. Nemain completes a trinity with pure chaos. Her domain is panic, the terror that grips soldiers when battle goes wrong, when formations break and men run. She represents the psychological dimension of warfare, the way fear can destroy an army as effectively as any weapon. Nemain is the scream that rises from dying men, the confusion that turns organized combat into chaotic slaughter. Together, these 3 create a complete picture of war's reality. Bab is the individual moment of death and the prophecy that foretells it. Macha is the political power that causes wars and rewards victors. Nemain is the psychological breakdown that determines outcomes. The Morrigan, as all 3 simultaneously, embodies everything war means. Second, her role in Ireland's greatest myths. The Morrigan appears prominently in the Ulster cycle, the collection of Irish myths centered on the warriors and kings of ancient Ulster. These aren't just adventure stories. They're explorations of heroism, fate, loyalty, and the relationship between humans and divine powers. Her most famous interactions involve Cú Chulainn, Ireland's greatest mythological hero. Cú Chulainn was a warrior of supernatural ability, capable of feats no ordinary human could accomplish. But even he couldn't escape Morrigan's influence. She appeared to him multiple times throughout his life, testing him, warning him, ultimately ensuring his fate unfolded as she had foreseen. The relationship between Morrigan and Cuchulainn reveals something crucial. Heroes might be mighty, but they're not beyond the reach of fate. The gods, particularly the Morrigan, operate on a level humans can't fully comprehend or resist. She also appears in stories involving Concobar mac Nessa, the King of Ulster, and other major heroes. Her presence in these myths isn't incidental. She actively shapes events, influences decisions, and drives the narrative toward fated outcomes. Third, what her names reveal. The titles Great Queen and Phantom Queen aren't random labels. They capture how the Irish conceptualized this goddess and what she represented. Great Queen emphasizes her power and authority. She's not a minor deity with limited influence. She's a queen, a ruler, someone who commands rather than serves. The Great modifier amplifies this further. She's the greatest, the most powerful, the one whose authority extends over life and death itself. This queenly aspect connects to ancient Irish concepts of sovereignty. The land itself was often personified as a goddess, and kings symbolically married the land to legitimize their rule. The Morrigan, as a sovereignty goddess through her Macha aspect, embodies that political spiritual connection. Phantom Queen captures her elusive supernatural nature. She appears and disappears. She takes multiple forms. You can't pin her down, can't predict when or how she'll manifest. This phantom quality makes her more terrifying. An enemy you can see and fight is manageable. An enemy who might be anywhere, who might already be influencing events in ways you can't detect. That's the stuff of nightmares. The phantom aspect also connects to her association with death. Phantoms are spirits, beings that exist between life and death. The Morrigan moves through that liminal space effortlessly. She sees the dead, the living, and those about to die all at once. Consider how these elements work together. You have a triple goddess, each aspect governing a different dimension of war and power. You have a figure who appears in mythology's greatest stories, shaping the fates of the mightiest heroes, and you have names that capture both her supreme authority and her impossible-to-grasp nature. The ancient Irish who told these stories weren't creating simple good versus evil narratives. They were exploring the reality that some forces operate beyond human control. The Morrigan personified those forces. She was the reminder that even heroes die, that even kings fall, that some powers can't be defeated or escaped, only acknowledged and respected. Understanding her identity sets the foundation for grasping her most famous role, choosing who lives and dies in battle. What if someone could decide your fate in battle before the first sword was drawn? Morrigan's role in warfare reveals how the ancient Irish understood combat not just as physical struggle, but as a stage where divine powers determined outcomes humans could only accept. Morrigan's primary function centers on war, but she's not a goddess of military strategy or martial skill. Her power operates on a more fundamental level. She chooses who lives and who dies. That decision shapes everything that follows. Let's explore her wartime role through 3 dimensions. Her power over life and death in combat, her physical manifestations on the battlefield, and how warriors attempted to gain her favor. First, her power to choose fates. In Irish mythology, the outcome of individual combat and entire battles often hinged on Morrigan's will. When warriors clashed, When armies met in the field, the Morrigan had already decided the result. The Morrigan's association with battlefield deaths goes beyond simply deciding who falls. She's present among the carnage, among the dying and the dead. She walks through the aftermath of combat, surveying the results of the violence she helped orchestrate. Ancient Irish warriors understood that going into battle meant entering the Morrigan's domain. The battlefield was her sacred space, where her power was absolute. Every wound dealt, every life taken, every death scream, all of it happened under her watchful gaze. Surviving combat meant she had permitted your survival. Dying meant she had marked you for death. This created a particular psychological state. Ancient Irish warriors certainly felt fear, but they also carried the understanding that death in battle wasn't random bad luck. It was chosen, fated, part of a larger pattern governed by divine will. Second, her manifestations as crow or raven. Morrigan didn't just make abstract decisions about who would die. She appeared physically on battlefields, though rarely in human form. Her most common manifestation was as a crow or raven. Imagine being an ancient Irish warrior preparing for combat. You're checking your weapons, trying to control your fear. Then you notice crows gathering nearby. Not just one or two, but many, more than seems natural. They're watching, waiting. You realize Morrigan is present, already anticipating the feast of corpses that will soon be available. Seeing a crow or raven before or during battle was an omen of death. But whose death? That was a terrifying question. Was the Morrigan's presence a sign that you specifically were marked? Or was she there for your enemy? Or simply there because many would die? The appearance of these birds could influence battle outcomes through pure psychology. If one side saw crows gathering near their position, morale could crack. Men might believe the Morrigan had chosen against them, that defeat and death were inevitable. That belief could become self-fulfilling. The crow form also allowed the Morrigan to move across battlefields freely. She could observe everything, perch on trees or rocks, invisible in her animal form, yet omnipresent. After battles, crows and ravens genuinely do gather to feed on the dead. The Morrigan, in her crow aspect, participated in this grisly feast. Third, how warriors sought her favour. Irish warriors weren't passive in the face of the Morrigan's power. They understood she could be honoured. That proper respect might earn her favour, or at least avoid her active hostility. Sacrifices were offered to the Morrigan before battles. Warriors would dedicate enemy blood to her, promise her the spoils of combat, perform rituals acknowledging her sovereignty over the battlefield. The logic was straightforward. If the Morrigan controls who lives and dies in war, then honouring her before fighting is simply practical. These practices reflected a coherent worldview. Death in battle was sacred, governed by divine power. Treating it casually would anger the goddess who controlled it. Better to acknowledge her role, honour her with appropriate offerings, and hope for her favour. But the Morrigan wasn't a goddess who simply rewarded devotion with protection. Her presence in myths often causes confusion, fear, and panic among troops. Even those who honoured her might find themselves on the receiving end of her terror-inducing power. When the Morrigan manifested on a battlefield, her mere presence could cause chaos. Men would see things that weren't there, hear phantom sounds, lose track of allies and enemies. Orderly battle would dissolve into confused violence where warriors struck at shadows and fled from nothing. The relationship between warriors and the Morrigan was one of fearful respect rather than loving devotion. You didn't worship the Morrigan hoping for comfort. You acknowledged her power, performed appropriate rituals, and hoped desperately that when she chose who would die, she would choose someone else. Consider the full picture. Every battle was a sacred event governed by the Morrigan. She decided outcomes before fighting began. She appeared as crows and ravens, omens and witnesses of death. Warriors offered her sacrifices, seeking favor or at least neutrality. And her presence itself could turn organized combat into chaotic slaughter through the fear she inspired. Understanding her role in war naturally leads to exploring the methods she used to influence events, her extraordinary powers of transformation. What if you could never be certain who or what you were really dealing with? Morrigan's shape-shifting abilities made her the ultimate unpredictable force, appearing as crow, wolf, woman, or beast, according to her inscrutable purposes. The Morrigan didn't manifest in just one form. She was a master of transformation, capable of appearing as various animals, as a beautiful woman, as a hideous crone, or as a towering giantess. This shape-shifting was central to how she operated and what she represented. Let's examine her transformations through three perspectives: the range of forms she could take, how she used different forms to manipulate heroes, and what her shape-shifting symbolized. First, the catalogue of forms. The Morrigan appeared most commonly as a crow or raven, but she also took many other shapes. She could manifest as a wolf, that predator associated with hunting and savage violence. The wolf form connected her to warfare's more chaotic, feral aspects. Wolves don't fight duels according to rules. They hunt, they tear, they devour. She took the form of a horse, particularly a red mare in some stories. Horses were associated with sovereignty and kingship in Celtic culture. They represented power, nobility, and the authority to rule. She could appear as a beautiful young woman or a hideous old crone, sometimes shifting between these forms within a single encounter. The beautiful woman form could seduce, distract, or test heroes. The crone form might offer prophecies or curses. She could become a giantess, towering over human warriors, emphasizing her divine nature and the vast gulf between mortal and goddess. The range of forms reveals something important. The Morrigan wasn't limited to a single nature. She was fluid, mutable, capable of being whatever the situation required. This made her impossible to predict or prepare for. Second, how she used transformations to manipulate events. The Morrigan didn't shapeshift randomly. Each transformation served a purpose in her larger plans. Her most famous uses of shapeshifting involve Cuchulainn. She appeared to him in multiple forms throughout his life, each encounter testing him, warning him, or steering him toward his fated end. In one story, she approached Cuchulainn as a beautiful woman, offering her love and assistance. He rejected her, not recognizing the goddess or simply unwilling to accept help he hadn't earned. This rejection angered her and had consequences. Later, she attacked him during a crucial battle, taking the forms of eel, wolf, and heifer in succession. As an eel, she tripped him while he fought in a river ford. As a wolf, she caused cattle to stampede into the battlefield. As a heifer leading the stampede, she directly threatened him. Cuchulainn wounded her in each form, but these attacks still hindered him at critical moments. These transformations served multiple purposes. They punished Cuchulainn for his earlier rejection. They tested his ability to fight despite unexpected complications. They demonstrated that even Ireland's greatest hero couldn't escape Morrigan's influence. The Morrigan also used transformations to deliver warnings or prophecies. She might appear as a crow to announce someone's coming death, or as an old woman washing bloody armour at a ford, a famous omen that the armour's owner would soon die in battle. Third, what shapeshifting symbolised. Morrigan's transformations represented deeper truths about war, fate, and divine power. War itself is unpredictable. A battle can turn on a broken spear, a moment of confusion, an unexpected attack. Morrigan's shapeshifting embodied that unpredictability. Just as you can't know what the next moment of battle will bring, you can't know what form the Morrigan will take. Fate operates similarly. You might think you understand your situation, then something you didn't anticipate changes everything. The Morrigan as shapeshifter represented fate's ability to surprise, to approach from angles you weren't watching. The animal forms carried specific symbolic weight. Crows meant death and prophecy. Wolves meant chaotic violence. Horses meant sovereignty and power. Each animal form emphasized different aspects of the Morrigan's complex nature. The shifts between beautiful woman and hideous crone represented the dual nature of war itself. War can seem glorious, attractive even, especially to young warriors seeking glory. Morrigan was a beautiful woman with that attractive face. But war's reality is ugly and brutal. The Morrigan as crone was that truth revealed. Her ability to appear as a giantess represented divine power's ultimate nature. Gods operate on a different scale than humans. The giantess form made that scale difference visible. Warriors couldn't simply prepare for the Morrigan. They had to be ready for anything because she could be anything. This kept heroes off balance, unable to rely on simple solutions. The shape-shifting also meant the Morrigan could be present anywhere, in any form, at any time. This omnipresence reinforced her power and the futility of trying to escape her influence. This pervasive, shape-shifting presence naturally connects to another of Morrigan's key powers, her ability to see and speak the future. What if you could see exactly how your story ends but couldn't change it? Morrigan's prophetic powers made her both oracle and executioner, seeing fates written in patterns humans couldn't perceive, and ensuring those fates unfolded exactly as predicted. Morrigan possessed profound prophetic abilities, seeing futures with clarity that made them essentially inevitable. This power made her central to Irish mythology's exploration of destiny and free will. Let's explore her prophetic role through 3 dimensions: how she predicted specific outcomes, how she embodied fate itself, and how her prophecies influenced decisions. First, predicting battles and deaths. The Morrigan could see how specific battles would unfold, who would die, who would survive, and what the larger consequences would be. Her prophecies were specific, detailed, and accurate. Her most famous prophecy involved Cuchulainn's death in the Tambour Cuailnge, the great cattle raid epic. She appeared to him and warned him about his coming end. She described the circumstances that would lead to it. She made clear that his death was approaching and inevitable. Cuchulainn, being a hero, didn't simply accept this passively. He tried to avoid the fate she predicted. But Irish mythology demonstrates repeatedly that you can't escape fate by trying to avoid it. Often, the very actions taken to prevent a prophecy are what cause it to come true. She also prophesied the outcomes of major battles. Before armies clashed, she might appear and describe what was coming, which side would win, how many would die, what treachery or heroism would determine the result. After some battles, she would appear and prophesy what would come next. She might describe future conflicts, the eventual fate of the victorious kingdom, or disasters approaching from directions no one was watching. Second, the Morrigan is the embodiment of fate. In Irish mythology, fate wasn't just abstract destiny. It was personified in the form of deities like the Morrigan who saw the patterns and ensured they unfolded correctly. The Morrigan wasn't just recording fate or observing it neutrally. She was actively involved in making it happen. She chose who would die in battle, then ensured those deaths occurred. She prophesied events, then participated in bringing them about. She was both oracle and agent, seer and actor. This dual role made her terrifying. If she simply predicted the future without influencing it, you might hope to change the outcome. But Morrigan's predictions came with the implicit promise that she would work to make them true. Irish mythology presents a worldview where fate is real, knowable to divine powers, and ultimately inescapable. Humans have agency and make choices, but those choices unfold within parameters set by fate. Heroes can decide to face death with courage or attempt cowardly flight. But if the Morrigan has marked them for death, they will die either way. The Morrigan, as fate personified, represented certain natural laws. Warriors die in battle, that's the nature of warfare. Kingdoms rise and fall, that's the nature of political power. Death comes to everyone eventually. The Morrigan seeing and speaking these futures was divine insight into patterns that were always there. Third, how prophecies influence decisions. Kings, warriors, and heroes who encountered Morrigan's prophecies had to decide how to respond, and those decisions shaped events. Some chose to believe and adjust their strategies accordingly. If the Morrigan said a particular battle would end in defeat, perhaps you avoid that battle or negotiate instead. This pragmatic response treated prophecy as valuable intelligence. But the myths show that trying to avoid prophesied fates often backfired. The steps taken to prevent a predicted outcome might be the very things that caused it. Some heroes responded with defiance. They knew what was fated, but chose to fight against it anyway, even knowing they would fail. This wasn't stupidity. It was heroism, the choice to maintain dignity and courage even in the face of inevitable defeat. Leaders sometimes use the Morrigan's prophecies to motivate troops or demoralize enemies. If the goddess had predicted your victory, that was powerful psychological warfare. Strategic decisions about warfare could all be influenced by prophecies. A king who heard Morrigan describe his kingdom's fall might make different choices about succession, alliances, or military campaigns. Morrigan's prophetic powers made her central to Irish mythology's exploration of destiny. She was the voice declaring what must be, the force ensuring it came to pass, and the witness who remembered how heroes responded when faced with inescapable fate. Her ability to take various animal forms connected directly to this prophetic role, as certain creatures became omens announcing her knowledge of coming events. Why do certain animals still carry ominous meanings in folklore? The creatures associated with the Morrigan weren't random choices, but powerful symbols that communicated her presence and purposes to those who could read the signs. Morrigan's connections to specific animals ran deeper than her ability to take their forms. These creatures became her symbols, her messengers, and her physical manifestations in the world. Let's examine this through three categories: the death birds, the chaos animals, and the sovereignty symbols. First, crows and ravens are death omens. These black scavenger birds were so closely associated with the Morrigan that in some contexts the terms were almost interchangeable. Crows and ravens naturally gather at battlefields because they feed on corpses. This ecological reality made them perfect symbols for a goddess of battle and death. They arrive when and where death occurs, but the association went deeper. In Irish mythology, crows and ravens possess prophetic significance. They were creatures that existed at the boundary between life and death, between this world and the other world. They could see things humans couldn't. A crow appearing before battle wasn't just coincidence. It was Morrigan checking on the warriors she had marked for death, or warning of the slaughter to come. Warriors who saw crows gathering knew that death was present. The specific behavior of crows carried meaning. A crow circling over someone's head was a particularly bad omen, suggesting that person was marked for death. Crows gathering in unusual numbers indicated supernatural significance. After battles, crows and ravens would descend on the corpses, feasting on the eyes and flesh of the fallen. This was the Morrigan in her most literal form, consuming the dead, participating in the physical reality of death's aftermath. That image became inseparable from Morrigan's identity. The connection between crows and prophecy extended beyond battlefields. If you saw a crow in unusual circumstances, wise people paid attention. The Morrigan might be sending a message, warning of danger, or announcing that fate was about to shift. Second, wolves are symbols of chaos and frenzy. Morrigan's connection to wolves emphasized the wild, uncontrolled violence that turns battles from organized combat into bloody chaos. Wolves were predators who hunted in packs, intelligent and deadly. They represented a kind of violence different from human warfare. Humans fight with weapons and strategy. Wolves simply hunt, tear, and kill with pure savage efficiency. In her encounters with Cuchulainn, one of her forms was as a wolf causing cattle to stampede through the battlefield. This wasn't random chaos. It was calculated disruption, using animals to create confusion and danger. Wolves also symbolized a breakdown of social order. Celtic society depended on livestock. Wolves threatened those animals, representing forces hostile to civilization. The Morrigan as wolf embodied that threat, the return of chaos when order breaks down. In battle, the wolf aspect represented battle frenzy, that state where warriors lost themselves in violence and fought with animal savagery. When Bab, the Morrigan's battle frenzy aspect, took hold, warriors became like wolves, focused solely on killing, indifferent to their own safety, driven by bloodlust rather than reason. Third, horses as sovereignty symbols. Morrigan's association with horses, particularly as a red mare, connected her directly to political power and the right to rule. In Celtic culture, horses were royal animals. They represented speed, power, mobility, and nobility. Kings rode horses. Cavalry was the elite military force. Controlling horses meant controlling territory and commanding respect. The Morrigan's Macha aspect tied closely to horses and sovereignty. Macha was a horse goddess in some traditions, and her name connected to concepts of kingship and territorial control. When the Morrigan appeared as a horse, she was manifesting her sovereignty dimension. Horses in myths often signaled questions of legitimate authority. Who has the right to rule this land? Which king deserves the crown? The Morrigan's presence as a horse indicated that these sovereignty questions were active, that power was being contested or transferred. The red colour often associated with her horse form carried its own symbolism. Red meant blood, war, danger, but also vitality and life force. A red mare was a powerful, dangerous creature, beautiful and deadly, much like the Morrigan herself. These animal symbols worked together to communicate Morrigan's presence and purposes. Scavenger birds announced death. Wolves brought chaos and frenzy. Horses indicated sovereignty contests. Each animal form emphasized different aspects of her power. The appearances of these animals in myths weren't coincidental. When crows gathered, when wolves howled, when horses behaved strangely, these were signals that the Morrigan was near or that events under her influence were unfolding. The persistence of these symbols shows their power. Even today, crows carry ominous associations in folklore. Wolves still represent wild danger. Horses still suggest nobility and power. The Morrigan's animal symbols have outlasted belief in the goddess herself because they tap into something fundamental about how humans understand these creatures. Understanding these animal symbols helps us grasp how the Morrigan interacted with individual heroes, using these forms and others to test, guide, curse, or destroy. What happens when divine power confronts human heroism? The Morrigan's encounters with Ireland's greatest warriors reveal how gods test mortals and how even the mightiest heroes must navigate forces they can't defeat. The Morrigan didn't remain distant from human affairs. She actively engaged with heroes, particularly those in the Ulster cycle. These interactions shaped the heroes' fates and demonstrated the limits of human power. Let's explore these encounters through 3 dimensions: why she appeared to heroes, how she communicated with them, and what her interactions revealed about fate and prophecy. First, testing courage, strength, and loyalty. The Morrigan appeared to heroes not just to observe but to test them. These tests reveal character, determined worthiness, and sometimes sealed fates. Her encounters with Cuchulainn exemplify this testing pattern. When she first approached him as a beautiful woman offering love and assistance, this was a test. Would he accept help from a divine source? Would he recognize the goddess in disguise? Would he respond with appropriate respect? Cuchulainn failed that particular test. He rejected her, proud in his own abilities and unwilling to accept aid he hadn't earned through his own merit. This rejection had consequences that followed him for the rest of his life. The tests weren't always about acceptance or rejection. Sometimes the Morrigan tested whether heroes could fight despite supernatural interference. She would attack during crucial battles, taking multiple forms, creating obstacles. A hero who maintained focus despite these distractions proved exceptional. Loyalty tests also appeared. Would a warrior honor commitments even when the Morrigan offered easier paths? Would a king maintain his word when breaking it might save his kingdom? These tests of character mattered to the goddess who governed sovereignty and legitimacy. The tests served divine purposes beyond individual assessment. They demonstrated to all who heard these stories that heroism meant more than physical prowess. True heroes maintained honor even when tested by gods. They faced impossible situations with courage. They accepted their fates with dignity. Second, cryptic and threatening communications. The Morrigan rarely spoke plainly. Her advice and warnings came wrapped in riddles, omens, and ambiguous language that heroes had to interpret. When she warned Cuchulainn about his approaching death, she didn't give him a simple schedule. She spoke in poetic, prophetic language that required interpretation. This cryptic style wasn't cruelty or game-playing. It reflected the nature of prophecy itself. The future isn't a script to be read. It's a pattern to be discerned. Her communications often carried implicit threats. Accept her help and respect her power, or face consequences. Honor her role in warfare, or find yourself marked for death. These weren't empty threats. The Morrigan had the power to follow through. Sometimes her guidance was genuinely helpful despite its cryptic nature. She would warn heroes of treachery, alert them to dangers they couldn't see, offer advice that could save their lives if properly understood and heeded. But even helpful advice from Morrigan came with an edge of danger. The threatening tone reflected her nature. She wasn't a nurturing goddess offering comfort. She was a power to be respected and feared. Her communications reminded heroes that they existed at the mercy of forces beyond their control. Heroes who listened carefully and responded appropriately could benefit from Morrigan's advice. Those who dismissed her warnings or failed to show proper respect found themselves facing the consequences of angering a goddess. Third, guide or destroyer, depending on response. The Morrigan could be either depending on how heroes treated her. This conditional nature made interactions with her particularly tense. For heroes who showed appropriate respect and responded correctly to her tests, the Morrigan could serve as a guide. She might steer them away from certain death, provide prophetic insight, or simply refrain from actively working against them. This wasn't friendship or alliance. It was an acknowledgement of a hero's worthiness. But for those who failed her tests, rejected her offers, or showed disrespect, the Morrigan became a destroyer. She would actively work to bring about their deaths, manipulate events against them, and ensure their fates turned bitter. Conchobar, Magnessa, and other Ulster cycle heroes all had their own encounters with the Morrigan. Each interaction followed the same general pattern. The goddess appeared, tested or challenged the hero, and the hero's response determined whether she would help or hinder. These interactions demonstrated the power of fate and prophecy. Even when the Morrigan offered warnings or guidance, heroes couldn't always escape the fates she had foreseen. Cuchulainn knew his death was coming, but couldn't avoid it. The prophecy unfolded exactly as the Morrigan had predicted. The manipulations the Morrigan employed revealed her role as an agent of fate. She didn't just observe destiny unfolding. She actively arranged events to ensure prophecies came true. If she had predicted a hero's death, she would work to bring that death about through her various powers. Consider the full pattern. The Morrigan appears to a hero, often in disguise or unexpected form. She tests them through challenges, offers, or obstacles. She communicates in ways that require interpretation. The hero's response determines whether she becomes a guide or destroyer. But ultimately, the fate she has foreseen will unfold regardless, because she has both seen and will actively work to create that outcome. These interactions with individual heroes reflected larger principles about the relationship between human agency and divine will. Heroes could choose how to respond to the Morrigan, and those choices mattered for honor and legacy. But the ultimate outcomes were determined by powers beyond human control. The Morrigan's interactions with heroes weren't just personal encounters. They reflected her broader role in governing sovereignty and the right to rule. What gives a king the right to rule? In ancient Ireland, the answer wasn't just military strength or noble birth. It required the blessing of the Morrigan, whose sovereignty aspect could make or break kingdoms. The Morrigan, particularly through her macha aspect, held profound influence over kingship and political authority. Her approval meant legitimate rule. Her displeasure meant disaster. Let's explore this through 3 dimensions: how she tied to the right to rule, what happened when rulers failed to honor her, and what this revealed about divine authority and leadership. First, the Morrigan's connection to sovereignty. In Celtic tradition, the land itself was often personified as a goddess. Kings didn't just conquer territory. They symbolically married the land represented by its goddess to legitimize their rule. The Morrigan's macha aspect embodied this sovereignty function. She represented the divine authority that validated kingship. A king who ruled with the Morrigan's blessing ruled legitimately. One who lacked her approval was a usurper, his reign temporary and doomed. Kings sought her blessing through various means: rituals before coronation, offerings at sacred sites, demonstrations of valor in battle. All these could earn the Morrigan's favor. The blessing wasn't automatic or guaranteed. Kings had to prove themselves worthy. This system served a purpose beyond religious observance. It provided a check on royal power. A king who ruled badly, who violated sacred laws or mistreated his people, risked losing Morrigan's favor. That loss of divine sanction could trigger rebellion or invasion. The connection between the Morrigan and sovereignty also linked warfare directly to political authority. Wars weren't just about territory or resources. They were tests of legitimate kingship. Victory in battle demonstrated that the Morrigan favored your claim to rule. Defeat suggested she had withdrawn her blessing. This meant that military outcomes carried profound political implications. A king who lost battles didn't just lose territory. He lost the divine mandate to rule. Conversely, a successful war leader could claim kingship based on the Morrigan's evident favor. Second, the consequences of failing to honor her. Refusal to honor the Morrigan, or actions that offended her, could result in devastating curses or misfortune. Myths show her punishing rulers who disrespected her. These punishments weren't minor inconveniences. They included battlefield defeats, personal curses, fertility failures affecting the entire land, and the collapse of kingdoms. One famous pattern involves rulers who failed to acknowledge the Morrigan's role in their victories. A king who won battles but attributed success solely to his own skill or his warrior's valor, without recognizing divine influence, risked the goddess's wrath. The punishments could extend beyond individual rulers to entire lands and populations. The Morrigan's curse might cause crops to fail, livestock to sicken, or plagues to strike. The people suffered for their king's offense, creating pressure for that ruler to make amends or be replaced. These myths reinforced important social principles. Leaders needed humility before divine powers. Success requires acknowledging sources beyond human ability. Authority came with obligations, including proper respect for the spiritual forces that granted legitimacy. The threat of Morrigan's punishment also served as a check on tyranny. A king who ruled unjustly might face her curse, providing a supernatural justification for resistance or rebellion. This didn't guarantee justice, but it provided a framework for challenging illegitimate authority. Third, the link between divine authority, leadership, and warfare. Morrigan's sovereignty role revealed how Celtic society understood the relationship between these elements. Leadership wasn't just administrative or political skill. It was a sacred trust requiring divine approval. The Morrigan represented that divine dimension. She was the power that decided whether a leader deserved to command. Warfare served as the primary test of that legitimacy. The battle was where Morrigan's favour became visible. A king who consistently won wars demonstrated her blessing. One who lost repeatedly showed that divine approval had been withdrawn. This created a system where military success and political authority reinforced each other. Victory in battle proved legitimate kingship. Legitimate kingship, backed by divine favour, increased chances of military success. The cycle could be virtuous or vicious, depending on whether the Morrigan blessed or cursed a ruler. The myths demonstrate this principle repeatedly. Kings who honoured the Morrigan, who performed proper rituals and showed appropriate respect, tended to succeed in their military campaigns and maintain stable rule. Those who neglected or offended her faced defeat, rebellion, or mysterious disasters that undermined their authority. This system also explained historical changes in power. When one kingdom fell and another rose, when one dynasty replaced another, these weren't just human events. They reflected shifts in divine favour. The Morrigan had withdrawn her blessing from the old ruler and granted it to the new one. Understanding sovereignty through this lens reveals how deeply warfare, politics, and spirituality were intertwined in Celtic worldview. You couldn't separate these domains. Success in one required attention to all three. Morrigan's role in sovereignty also connected to her other functions. As a goddess of war, she determined battle outcomes. As a goddess of prophecy, she foresaw which kingdoms would rise or fall. As a goddess of death, she could remove rulers who had lost her favour. All these powers served her sovereignty function, ensuring that only those with divine approval ruled. Consider the implications for how ancient Irish kings understood their position. You weren't just managing territory and commanding warriors. You were serving as the land's symbolic husband, maintaining a relationship with divine powers, demonstrating through your conduct that you deserved the Morrigan's blessing. This was tremendous pressure and responsibility. The influence on kings and sovereignty naturally leads to examining Morrigan's most fearsome power, her ability to curse those who angered her. What happens when a goddess decides you've earned her wrath? The Morrigan's curses reveal the terrifying reach of divine power and the reality that some forces, once angered, cannot be appeased or escaped. The Morrigan could curse humans, clans, or entire armies with devastating results. These curses weren't empty threats or minor inconveniences. They were catastrophic events that destroyed lives, shattered armies, and toppled kingdoms. Let's explore this dark aspect through 3 dimensions: the nature and range of her curses, how she used them strategically, and what they represented about nature's destructive power. First, the catalogue of curses. The Morrigan's curses took many forms, each designed to achieve specific destructive purposes. Battlefield defeat was among her most common curses. An army that angered the Morrigan would find itself unable to win, no matter the odds or skill. Warriors would fight bravely but lose anyway. Strategies that should work would fail. Weapons would break at crucial moments. The curse ensured defeat regardless of human effort. Disease curses brought sickness to individuals, families, or entire populations. These weren't natural illnesses that physicians could treat. They were supernatural, afflictions that resisted all remedies. People would waste away, suffer mysterious symptoms, or die suddenly with no apparent cause. Panic curses manifested in the main aspect of the Morrigan. An army under this curse would experience overwhelming terror in battle. Experienced warriors would suddenly flee. Formations would break for no visible reason. Men would see phantom horrors that drove them mad with fear. This psychological curse could destroy military forces without any actual combat. Madness curses affected the mind directly. Victims would lose their reason, act erratically, become violent toward allies, or descend into depression and self-destruction. Kings cursed with madness might make disastrous decisions that doomed their kingdoms. Warriors might turn on their companions or commit acts that violated all honor codes. Fertility curses struck at the foundation of survival. The cursed land would not produce crops. Livestock would not breed or would birth deformed young. Women would not conceive or would miscarry. These curses threatened the continuation of entire communities. Some curses were highly specific and personal. A warrior who angered the Morrigan might find himself unable to wound certain enemies, or his weapons ineffective at crucial moments, or his allies mysteriously absent when he needed them most. The curse would engineer his death through carefully arranged circumstances. Second, strategic use of curses. The Morrigan didn't curse randomly or out of petty spite. Her curses served strategic purposes in the larger patterns of fate and power. She used curses to punish disrespect or violations of sacred law. When heroes like Cuchulainn rejected her, or when kings failed to honor her properly, curses enforced consequences. This maintained the proper relationship between divine and human realms. Gods demanded respect, and curses ensured that disrespect carried costs. Curses altered war outcomes according to her prophetic vision. If the Morrigan had foreseen that a particular army must lose, she might curse them to ensure that outcome. The curse wasn't arbitrary. It was the mechanism through which fate became reality. She used curses to test heroes and leaders. Could they maintain courage when facing supernatural opposition? Would they persist in right action even when cursed? These tests revealed character and separated the truly heroic from those who merely possessed martial skill. Curses could also serve as warnings or lessons to broader society. When the Morrigan cursed an entire clan for offending her, everyone else learned that such offenses carried real consequences. The spectacular nature of her curses made them effective educational tools. Sometimes curses enforced natural limits. A king who overreached, trying to conquer territory beyond what was fated for him, might face curses that forced him back. This maintained balance and prevented any one power from dominating too completely. The strategic deployment of curses demonstrated that the Morrigan operated with purpose and intelligence. She wasn't a random force of chaos. She was a conscious power arranging events according to larger patterns. Third, representing nature's destructive power. Morrigan's curses embodied truths about the destructive and unavoidable aspects of nature and existence. Disease, disaster, death. These visit human communities regardless of virtue or effort. The Morrigan's curses personified that reality. No amount of skill, courage, or righteousness guarantees safety. Catastrophe can strike anyone, anywhere, anytime. The curses also represented war's inherent destructiveness. Combat doesn't respect individual worthiness. Good men die alongside bad. Skilled warriors fall to lucky strikes. Entire populations suffer for their leaders' decisions. Morrigan's battlefield curses captured this harsh reality. Madness and panic curses reflected psychological truths about trauma and fear. Battle breaks minds as surely as it breaks bodies. Terror can be as deadly as weapons. Morrigan's ability to inflict these states acknowledged that mental and emotional destruction are real and devastating. Fertility curses touched on the deepest fears, that the land might not provide, that children might not come, that the community might not continue. These existential threats were always present in ancient agricultural societies. The Morrigan's fertility curses embodied those ever-present dangers. The unavoidable nature of her curses represented fate's inexorable quality. Just as you can't escape death, you can't escape the Morrigan's curse once it's pronounced. This reinforced mythology's teachings about accepting what can't be changed while maintaining dignity in how you respond. Consider the full picture. The Morrigan could curse individuals or entire populations. Her curses included defeat, disease, panic, madness, and fertility failure. She used them strategically to enforce divine will and ensure fated outcomes, and they represented the unavoidable destructive forces that are part of existence itself. The example of entire clans suffering for angering her demonstrates the collective nature of consequences in Celtic society. One person's offense could doom many. This reinforced communal responsibility and the importance of maintaining proper relationships with divine powers. The curses also explain how ancient people understood disasters. When catastrophe struck, when battles were inexplicably lost, when disease swept through communities, these weren't random events. They were the Morrigan's curses, the result of divine displeasure, or the working out of fated patterns. Understanding the Morrigan's curses and their devastating power naturally leads to exploring how her presence and influence have persisted beyond ancient mythology into folklore and modern culture. Why does an ancient war goddess still appear in modern stories and spiritual practices? Morrigan's enduring presence reveals how powerful mythological figures can transcend their original context to speak to universal human experiences. The Morrigan didn't disappear when belief in the old Irish gods faded. She persisted in folklore, literature, and eventually modern media and neo-pagan practices. Her symbolism and stories continue to resonate across centuries. Let's explore this persistence through 3 dimensions: her appearance in literature and media, the continuation of her symbols in Irish culture, and her meaning for contemporary spirituality and feminism. First, literature and modern media. Morrigan appears in countless modern works, from fantasy novels to video games to television shows. Contemporary fantasy literature often features Morrigan or characters based on her. Writers are drawn to her complexity. She's not simply good or evil, but a force beyond human morality. Her multiple aspects, her shape-shifting, her connection to fate and death, all these elements provide rich material for storytelling. In modern media, the Morrigan appears in various forms. Video games use her as a character representing fate, war, or dark magic. Television shows exploring Celtic mythology invariably include her. Comic books and graphic novels depict her battles with heroes or her role in divine conflicts. These modern appearances sometimes stay close to original myths, portraying her as a triple goddess of war and prophecy. Other times, they reinterpret her freely, adapting ancient stories to contemporary concerns and storytelling conventions. Neo-pagan practices have embraced the Morrigan as a deity for modern worship. Practitioners drawn to Celtic spirituality often honor her through rituals, offerings, and meditation. They see her as embodying female power, sovereignty over one's own life, and the courage to face difficult truths. Modern pagans interpret the Morrigan in ways that speak to contemporary needs. She becomes a goddess of empowerment, teaching that strength includes accepting death and fate. She represents the warrior spirit needed to fight for justice or protect what matters. She embodies the wildness that resists social conformity. Some neo-pagan groups specifically dedicated to Morrigan have formed, creating communities around her worship. These groups often emphasize her sovereignty aspect, seeing her as teaching self-determination and personal power. Second, crow omens in Irish storytelling. The association between crows and death, prophecy, and the Morrigan has persisted in Irish folklore long after direct worship of the goddess ceased. Irish stories and superstitions about crows carry echoes of the Morrigan's presence. A crow landing on a house roof might portend death. Unusual crow behavior signals that something significant is about to happen. These folk beliefs maintain the ancient connection between corvids and fate. Traditional Irish storytelling preserved tales about the Morrigan, passing them down through generations even when they were no longer understood as religious truth. The stories became cultural heritage, examples of how ancestors understood the world. The crow's place in Irish symbolism remains distinct, partly because of the Morrigan. These birds carry meanings in Ireland that go beyond their roles in other cultures. They're not just clever scavengers. They're links to ancient powers and prophecies. Modern Irish writers and artists reference Morrigan and her crows, drawing on this cultural heritage to create works that resonate with both local and universal themes. The imagery remains potent and recognizable. Third, symbolizing female power and independence. The Morrigan has become an important symbol in discussions of female power, particularly power that doesn't conform to gentle or nurturing stereotypes. She represents a form of femininity that includes violence, death, sovereignty, and uncompromising strength. This provides an alternative to depictions of female deities as primarily maternal, loving, or peaceful. The Morrigan is powerful without being safe. For modern women seeking mythological models that validate strength and independence, the Morrigan offers an ancient precedent. She ruled her own domain, answered to no male authority, and exercised power over life and death. She chose when to help and when to destroy based on her own judgment. Her control over life and death particularly resonates. In cultures where women's reproductive choices are contested, a goddess who decides who lives and dies represents ultimate bodily autonomy and authority. The Morrigan's refusal to be confined to a single form or role also speaks to contemporary concerns about limiting categories. She is a warrior and prophet, beautiful woman and terrifying crone, crow and wolf and horse. She cannot be reduced to one simple identity. Her independence from male authority in myths distinguishes her from goddesses, who are defined primarily through relationships with male deities. Morrigan acts according to her own purposes. She tests male heroes, but isn't subordinate to them. This symbolism has made the Morrigan popular in feminist spirituality and women's empowerment movements. She's invoked as a patron of those who refuse to be victims, who claim their own power, who accept the darkness and difficulty in themselves and the world. The legacy that persists demonstrates several things. First, that powerful mythological figures can be reinterpreted for new contexts while maintaining core elements of their original character. The Morrigan in modern paganism isn't identical to the ancient goddess, but recognizable continuity exists. Second, that symbols and stories meeting deep psychological needs persist across cultural changes. The Morrigan addresses universal human experiences, facing death, exercising power, accepting fate, maintaining sovereignty over one's own life. These themes remain relevant regardless of whether anyone believes she's a literal goddess. Third, that cultural heritage survives in various forms. Even when direct religious practice ends, myths persist in folklore, storytelling, and artistic reference. The Morrigan's presence in Irish cultural memory demonstrates how thoroughly these stories embedded themselves. Modern fascination with the Morrigan highlights enduring human interests in fate, death, female power, and the supernatural. She represents aspects of existence that modern rationalism doesn't fully address, providing vocabulary and imagery for discussing experiences that resist purely materialistic explanation. Her continued relevance in Irish cultural references shows that mythology isn't just ancient history. It's a living tradition that each generation reinterprets according to its own needs and understanding. Having explored her persistence in culture, we can now step back and examine Morrigan's comprehensive power and what it reveals about Celtic worldview. What does it mean for a single deity to control war, death, prophecy, fate, and sovereignty simultaneously? Morrigan's comprehensive power reveals fundamental truths about how the ancient Celts understood mortality, destiny, and the forces that shape human existence. The Morrigan wasn't a specialist goddess with one narrow domain. She combined multiple aspects of divine power into a single, overwhelming presence. This combination made her central to Celtic mythology and worldview. Let's explore this through three perspectives: how her powers combined and reinforced each other, what this revealed about Celtic understanding of mortality and destiny, and her lasting influence on cultural memory. First, the integration of her powers. War, death, prophecy, fate, and sovereignty weren't separate for the Morrigan. They were interconnected aspects of a single divine authority. Her war power connected directly to death. Battle was where death occurred most dramatically and visibly. The Morrigan's presence on battlefields meant both controlling combat outcomes and presiding over the deaths that resulted. You couldn't separate her role as war goddess from her role as death goddess. Prophecy linked to fate. She could predict the future because she understood fate's patterns and actively worked to ensure they unfolded correctly. Her prophecies weren't guesses. They were statements about what would inevitably happen because she had both seen and would help create those outcomes. Sovereignty connected to war because political authority was established and maintained through military power. A king proved his right to rule through victory in battle, demonstrating Morrigan's favour. Losing wars suggested divine approval had been withdrawn, undermining legitimacy. Death connected to sovereignty because the death of a king meant political transition. Morrigan's ability to determine when rulers died gave her ultimate authority over political succession. Kingdoms changed hands when she decided the time had come. Fate encompassed all the others. War outcomes were fated. Deaths were fated. Sovereignty followed fated patterns. Prophecies described what fate had already determined. The Morrigan embodied fate itself, the inexorable pattern underlying all events. This integration meant that approaching the Morrigan in any of her aspects meant potentially encountering all her powers. A warrior seeking victory in battle was also dealing with death, fate, and potentially sovereignty questions. A king claiming legitimacy needed to consider war, prophecy, and the death that awaited him when his fated time ended. The combination created a deity of extraordinary scope and power. Most gods specialized. Morrigan's comprehensive authority made her one of the most significant figures in Celtic mythology. Second, what this revealed about Celtic worldview. Morrigan's nature demonstrated how the ancient Celts understood mortality and destiny. Death wasn't random or meaningless. It was governed by divine power, part of larger patterns, connected to war, fate, and political authority. Morrigan's comprehensive power showed that death existed within a meaningful framework, not as an absurd accident, but as a necessary element of cosmic order. Destiny was real and knowable, at least to divine powers. Morrigan's prophetic abilities demonstrated that the future already existed in some sense, that patterns determined outcomes before they manifested physically. This created a worldview where fate was genuine rather than illusion. But fate didn't eliminate human agency. Heroes could choose how to respond to their fates. Kings could rule well or badly within the constraints of what was fated for them. Morrigan's presence showed that divine powers set parameters, but humans made meaningful choices within those parameters. Mortality was central to existence, rather than a problem to be solved. Morrigan's power over death wasn't portrayed as evil or wrong. Death was natural, necessary, part of the cycle. Her role was ensuring death came at the right time, to the right people, according to fate's patterns. Authority derived from divine sources. The Morrigan's sovereignty aspect showed that legitimate power required supernatural blessing. This belief had practical implications, providing a check on tyranny and a framework for understanding political change. War was a sacred activity governed by divine powers. The Morrigan's war aspect elevated combat beyond mere violence. Battle was where fate manifested, where divine will became visible, where sovereignty questions were decided. This didn't make war good, but it made it meaningful. The comprehensive nature of Morrigan's power revealed a worldview where different aspects of existence interconnected rather than existing in isolation. War affected sovereignty. Death connected to fate. Prophecy revealed patterns underlying all events. Everything related to everything else, and the Morrigan embodied those relationships. Third, influence spanning mythology, folklore, and cultural memory. Morrigan's impact extended across time and cultural forms, demonstrating her profound significance. In mythology, she appeared in the most important stories, interacted with the greatest heroes, and shaped the outcomes of legendary events. Her presence in the Ulster cycle and other myth collections ensured her stories were preserved and transmitted across generations. As mythology transformed into folklore, the Morrigan's presence continued in altered forms. Her symbols, particularly crows, and her associations with death and prophecy, persisted in popular belief and storytelling, even after people stopped worshipping her as a goddess. Cultural memory retained her essence even when specific stories were forgotten. The idea of a powerful female deity associated with war, fate, and death remained part of Irish cultural identity. References to the Morrigan communicated shared understanding among those familiar with the tradition. Her influence on how Irish culture understood death, fate, female power, and sovereignty lasted far beyond the active period of Celtic paganism. These concepts bore her stamp, shaped by centuries of stories and beliefs centered on her character. Modern revivals of interest in Celtic mythology inevitably feature the Morrigan prominently. She's one of the most recognizable and compelling figures from Irish tradition, precisely because her comprehensive power and complex nature provide so much depth for exploration. The fear and respect she commanded demonstrated Celtic attitudes toward divine power. Gods weren't primarily sources of comfort or moral guidance. They were forces to be reckoned with, powers that shaped existence according to their own purposes. The Morrigan exemplified this conception of divinity. Her blending of seemingly contradictory aspects showed sophisticated religious thinking. She was beautiful and hideous, helpful and destructive, prophet and executioner. This complexity reflected understanding that existence itself contains contradictions, that powers can be simultaneously beneficial and dangerous. Consider the full scope. A triple goddess combining battle frenzy, sovereignty, and chaos. A deity who decided life and death in combat. A prophet who saw and shaped fate. A sovereign power who validated or destroyed kings. A force appearing as a crow, wolf, horse, woman, or giantess. A source of both curse and blessing depending on response. A presence persisting from ancient myth through folklore to modern culture. Morrigan's comprehensive power made her central to Celtic worldview on mortality and destiny. She represented the understanding that death comes to all, that fate operates according to patterns beyond human control, that power requires divine sanction, that war is sacred activity with supernatural dimensions. Her influence spanning mythology, folklore, and cultural memory demonstrates that truly significant religious figures don't disappear when belief systems change. They transform, adapt, and continue speaking to fundamental human concerns across centuries and cultural shifts. Morrigan endures because she addresses questions and experiences that remain relevant. How do we face mortality? What determines our fate? Where does legitimate authority come from? How do we respond when confronted by powers beyond our control? What does strength mean, particularly female strength? How do we maintain dignity when facing inevitable ends? These questions don't have simple answers, and Morrigan doesn't provide them. Instead, she embodies the complexity, ambiguity, and power surrounding these fundamental aspects of existence. That's why she mattered to the ancient Celts, persisted in folklore, and continues to fascinate modern audiences. Understanding the Morrigan means understanding a comprehensive vision of divine power that encompasses war, death, prophecy, fate, and sovereignty in a single figure. It means recognizing how mythology expressed deep truths about existence, mortality, and the human condition. And it means appreciating how powerful these symbols remain, continuing to speak across millennia to anyone wrestling with the mysteries of fate, death, and the forces that shape our lives.